Okay, I am Lisa Hooper. I am on the board of directors for New Orleans Chamber Orchestra, and we are here talking with composer Ryan Harrison. We are looking forward to pulling together and performing one of his new works entitled Les Cenelles. And we're here to talk with Ryan a little bit about his piece. So perhaps, Ryan, maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, and maybe some of your earliest musical influences.
Born and raised in New Orleans. Almost all of my education was in the city of New Orleans, De La Salle, University of New Orleans. Did a master's at Tulane. As far as earlier musical influences, like every kid, or almost like every kid, parents try to get their children interested in music through learning an instrument. Mine was the saxophone at first, switched to guitar, switched to piano, a host of instruments that I stuck with for a little while, but eventually they sort of just fell out of interest with me. But I always liked music, and when I started studying at the University of New Orleans, and the time came for me to choose a major, just discovering that you can study music composition as a discipline, and that just sparked the flames, and it's been an interesting journey since then. But
yeah, so you just answered the next question. It's like, was there a moment when you just like, I know this is what I'm going to be, or was it more of like that slow awakening?
As far as composing music, I think it was a bit of a slow awakening. There is that initial spark with music that I think happens maybe with a lot of people when they're younger, especially. But how that manifested wasn't so clear, or whether or not it was a professional route that one can take down, for instance. So. One moment, I guess, that comes to mind is after compiling enough credits to graduate with my undergrad degree in music composition, there was a bit of a panic moment. What will I do with the rest of my life? And I spent 2.5 years collecting prerequisites for med school, which was a very difficult and arduous task that got the better of me. And just after seeking advice from some mentors, one in particular, my longtime neighbor who's a doctor himself, an OBGYN, and just had the revelation that whatever path that you choose in life, it's going to be difficult, there's going to be pain, there's going to be struggle, and it's just a matter of asking yourself, can you pay that price? And I think I had to go through those hurdles in pre-med to realize that I'm not willing to do that for medicine, but with music I am willing to put in that time and energy. So.
Wow, that's amazing. And there is a lot of time and energy in music that's hidden from people out in the audience. There's a lot that happens. That's amazing. So the New Orleans Chamber Orchestra, we're getting ready to perform this piece, hopefully perform 2 performances, full orchestra or full chamber ensemble, right? And so we're curious to know from you directly, what was the inspiration for this particular piece, Les Cenelles? And perhaps you could talk a little bit about the literary text behind it, like why you chose that, why you chose these specific poems, and sort of that inspiration for the music.
When the New Orleans Chamber Orchestra initially approached me with this opportunity to write a piece based off of some poems, selected poems from Les Cenelles, I had never heard of the anthology before. And just after doing a little bit of research, discovering that all of the poems were created by freedmen of color in New Orleans in the 19th century. It's the first book of poems published by African Americans in 1845. Even the name itself, Les Cenelles, like what does this name entail? How does it relate to the poets? How does it relate to the poems? It eventually grew into more of an effort to make these songs about New Orleans and the musical and artistic history of New Orleans. And I can get a little bit into how I try to make those associations musically.
Can I sort of interject with a slightly new question? But we were talking about this just before we started this recording. And so when I did, your typical Google Translate, what does Les Cenelles mean in English? The result was, it is a type of finch common throughout England. Les Cenelles in southern Louisiana, as you just referenced, means something very, very different. Can you share a little bit what the local meaning is?
Yeah, so, and even then it's, perhaps a meaning that's lost to time, but back in the days of poets, that term referred to a mayhaw berry that was endemic to Louisiana, and maybe even the southeast region, but definitely Louisiana. And the poets, in attempting to choose a title for this anthology of poetry, came up with the idea of using Les Cenelles. And just a little back story about the poets and their social background that they emerged from in New Orleans. They occupied an interesting niche. They had more legal standing and rights than African slaves, but they didn't quite have the social liberties and social standing as French and Spanish settlers in Louisiana. And when we use that term Creole, I think it kind of has the connotation of in modern day languages, referring to someone who is of more or less, I guess you could say, equally mixed ancestry between Africans and European settlers. But I think in that time it just meant anyone from the New World. But all of the poets sort of come from this world where they were in between African slaves and the European settlers, and a culture emerged from this group where, in using mayhaws as a sort of a tradition in the culture, the men would go off into the swampy areas of Louisiana and risk. You can imagine what lies in swamps, crocodiles or alligators or snakes, and collect these berries. And they would bring them back to their mothers, or they would bring them back to their sweethearts as a courting display. And in choosing the term Les Cenelles, just harkens back to this tradition that emerged within the society of the Creole poets, or within Les Cenelles poets, and as a means to preserve the meaning, the time, the place, and the tradition of this unique group of people. So.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, because our normal, hey, internet, tell me, it's not going to tell you that, right? So that's fine. Thank you so much for sharing that. And so you chose, out of this compilation of poetry, you chose 4 specific poems. What was it about those 4 poems that made you say, these are the 4, and they're going to be arranged like this? How does that come about?
Oh, it's an interesting process. Starting off, before I set pencil to paper, just as a composer, there's no right way to do it, but in my case, I like to have sort of an overall form of the piece, even if it's just sort of a bullet point list of movements that I want to eventually sort of compose for. And just starting off with, I wanted to do 7 poems. I wanted to have multiple interludes. I wanted to have preludes, postludes, and I had this huge idea in mind that was eventually sort of whittled away by time. One of the big sort of motivating factor in just getting a dissertation piece done in time. So that constraint was a big consideration. As far as the context of the poems themselves, there are 88 poems. I think it's 84 to 88 poems in the anthology, and almost all of them are related to love in one way or another. The poets were largely inspired by French Romanticism. There's a French chansonnier, Nathaniel Béranger, that gets cited a little bit by some of the main contributors of the Les Cenelles poems, and so there was a lot of influence from the world of Romanticism. So it's unrequited love, attaining the love of a sweetheart, or in the case of Lessange, sort of being visited by a ghostly apparition who gives the artist the inspiration to keep trying. And so that weighing that with the need for contrast, there were a few poems in the collection that dealt with something that wasn't as more positive and uplifting, and any good work needs to have that sort of Janus aspect. There you have to sort of have the bad to sort of balance out the good. So there is the Orphan of the Tomb, L'Orphelin de Tombeau, which sort of fills that niche for the collection as a whole.
Right. That's fabulous. And maybe it's now is the time to actually identify what these poems are, right? So the first one is Au Printemps. That one was written by the initials BORS. And then, as you just mentioned, L'Orphelin des Tombeaux, yeah, by Elboise.
Reverse, yeah. Au Printemps is Elboise, and Orphan of the Tombs is Boers. So.
Thank you for that correction. And Le Songe was written by Armand Lanus, and Parmi les Paroles Toujours by Camille Thierry. Okay, so let's maybe segue into the music a little bit finally. Yeah, it's all great stuff, but let's get into the music. Can you maybe tell us about some of the compositional techniques that you called upon to sort of create? There are clearly 4 separate movements, but there is a little bit of a through line. Can you sort of talk about that a little bit?
Yes, so in tying into the inspiration that went into the piece, one approach that I like to take with my compositions is to try to make them as integrated as possible thematically. So taking the material that I had on hand, poets from New Orleans, my hometown is New Orleans. Let's do something that evokes more or less the spirit of New Orleans in terms of its artistic tradition. And even though the poets themselves, they may not have lived long enough to see the onset of jazz taking root in New Orleans in the early 20th century, blues music also too. One can say, jazz's roots itself sort of comes from these old blues traditions, and I wanted to take that approach in having blues and jazz, be it more in a traditional sense or as jazz's trajectory changed throughout the 20th century in terms of Coltrane changes or different expressions in post-bop. I wanted to have the spirit of jazz and blues take root within these pieces, but not in a way that was like a carbon copy or trying to lift, to sort of have a parody of jazz or blues, but just using those same musical elements and materials that blues musicians and jazz musicians use to create, collectively sort of create these genres. So within Les Cenelles, for instance, each song has its own sort of rendition of a 12-bar blues. I lean heavily on bluesy or jazzy harmonic inflections. The pieces, the song cycles, two faster movements have something along what you can say is a walking bass line. It's heavily syncopated. In the instrumentation itself, through the use of the clarinet and the trombone, two instruments in particular that were integral to jazz's beginnings, and just trying to find as many ways as I can to throw into this gumbo pot that is, that ended up as Listener.
I really love that, because now I'm thinking back, I had the luxury of listening to it in a version last night, and I can sort of, in my ears imagination, it's very much so taking essentially like a knitting hook or a crochet hook. I was just talking about knitting and crochet. It's like taking a crochet hook back to the time period of when, the musical styles of when those poems were written, and sort of pulling as you pull the hook through time, sort of pulling elements of all those musical styles. And I thought you sort of wove them together really, really effectively at the end, sort of picking up some of the classical musical styles and harmonies of that time period into the blues, jazz inflections, on into contemporary harmonies and inflections, which I thought was sort of fun and interesting. So speaking of fun and interesting, and having this opportunity to listen to it in person with the live ensemble in front of us, can you sort of tell us what people coming to hear the premiere of this work here in New Orleans, what can they expect to hear? What should they be listening for?
It's an interesting question. I always I start off with the mindset that I guess with comedy, if you have to explain a joke, is it really a joke or is it really funny? Mm-hmm. The gist of a joke, where sort of entails that the observer kind of has to find their way towards the sort of punchline. And at least in my case with these pieces and with it, all the music that I compose, I try to have the music represent or be emblematic of some usually intangible aspect of humanity. So on a simple level, it could be something like an emotion, fear, dread, triumph, happiness. But in the case of the poems, I try to have the piece sort of communicate or represent an experience. So L'Sange, for instance. The poem is about a struggling artist, I guess you can say, who's trying to find the inspiration to pick up his lyre and to play something that is meaningful, and you just can't seem to sort of get over the hurdle. And it's a situation that I've been in plenty of times. So that one particular poem sort of resonated with me a little bit compared to the other ones. But he falls asleep or falls into a daze of some kind, and he is visited by a ghostly apparition that is just, it goes by the name C. And in the poem she tells the struggling artist, I'm here, I'm beautiful, sing for me, play for me, do something of worth. And as he wakes, he suddenly sort of has the zeal and the courage to keep trying. So when the listener is listening to these pieces, and then in this one in particular, I want them to be able to put themselves in the shoes of not maybe necessarily a struggling artist, but that aspect of having difficulty finding something beautiful in life, for instance, or creating something beautiful, and for them to walk away from that piece with the courage to keep trying, with the hope that eventually it will find its way into your life. So.
That's really beautiful. Do you have anything that you want to share about some of the other movements? You just spoke a little bit about Essence, but do you have maybe break down each movement just a little bit, and then we can hear Chamber Orchestra director Maxime Samaroff perform little pieces on the piano, and then we'll sort of come back.
So let's see. Each one of the movements uses a quotation actually to start off the pieces from a collection of chansons by the French chansonnier mentioned earlier, Béranger. My own take on them, I sort of ornament them a little bit and make them more dynamic, I guess you can say. Many of them sort of have the sort of a church hymn profile to them. But Au Printemps is the poem itself is sort of a celebration for springtime and new life, exuberance, energy, high energy, I should say. And I wanted the music to sort of reflect that in some sense. So in the beginning of Au Printemps, and a little bit towards the recapitulation of the main verses, you will be able to hear some semblance that might resemble cacophonous or sort of like an aleatoric aspect of nature. If you were to just go outside and hear, bird calls or any sort of animal sounds, where you don't know when the next bird call will come in or what it will be juxtaposed against next. And I wanted snippets of that world to sort of express themselves into the piece. And L'Orphelin de Tambour, the one poem in particular that doesn't have a positive sort of thematic content. It's about It's basically an epitaph for an orphan. We don't know exactly if this poem was inspired by like a real occasion of maybe the poet encountered a sight like that and decided to to sort of honor perhaps a fallen an orphan, or if it's just completely fictitious. But I wanted the piece to sort of have, and again, sort of tying into the theme of New Orleans, sort of a funeral march of some kind. So when you're listening to Orphan at the Tombs, it starts off as sort of a very stately march, but the sort of symmetric or regular metric scheme of the strings and of the instruments sort of gradually dissolves into something that's a little bit more amorphous, and before sort of returning to the more sort of stately and regular march. The Songe, it's sort of a interesting, as mentioned earlier, just the quest of an artist in trying to find their voice or find their vision, especially in the midst of struggle and adversity, and just sort of the awe-inspiring moment of finding beauty, I guess you could say. And Parle Toujours is one of the many love poems in the collection, and I think of all of the poems, that one gave me the impression of young love in particular. Very frenzied and frantic, and sort of full of extremes. So I wanted the music to sort of capture that energy. It's the most notey probably of the songs in the song cycle, and I would hope that the listener sort of feels like the music is taking them on a journey or taking them on a sort of like a wild experience in the same way where a young person might feel whenever they encounter someone that they're infatuated with. So.
I love that so much. So you just told us a little bit about the music. Let's sort of return a little bit to you, and sort of thinking more broadly about your creative work in general, beyond this piece, and sort of you beyond this performance that we're working towards. And I just sort of love, I'm fascinated that birds seem to play a really big part in your creative work. I know you have some really stunning bird photography in your artistic portfolio. And birds seem to figure in some of your other compositional work. And so I'm just curious, where does this interest and birds come from, and sort of if you can maybe describe a little bit about how you integrate birds and bird sounds into your compositional work.
Yeah. The interest in birds started, I guess, maybe since when I was a child, in terms of being interested in reptiles in particular. So I was allergic to, and I guess I still am allergic to, sort of furry things, so I could never really have dogs or cats or typical pets. So I've always had either turtles or birds as pets. And it was a little bit later down the road when I started graduate school here at Tulane, actually, where I just sort of haphazardly discovered this interesting article about sort of Archaeopteryx, this creature that's sort of in between bird and sort of a theropod dinosaur. So it looks like a dinosaur, but it has wings and feathers. It has a beak, but it has teeth also. So, but just like learning of the close genetic relationship between birds and reptiles was a huge, just revelatory experience, and it spurred me on to take interest in all of the birds and sights and sounds and shapes and colors that we get for free just by walking outdoors. Mm-hmm. And it led to, well, I want to record these experiences. So it led to getting a camera. It led to getting a more expensive camera. It led to getting an expensive lens, and it's a hobby. I understand why now. It's a retired person's hobby, I guess you can say. So, just in terms of the amount of resources and time that you would have to put into getting quality shots. But as far as how birds themselves integrate into my music, I've never tried to use or notate or dictate a bird call into my music. Actually, it's not to disregard that approach. Olivier Messiaen has made. He's etched his name in stone off of bird calls. But I've always just had the proclivity to to prefer the real thing. Mm-hmm. And the moments where I do drive, where I derived inspiration from birds, it's either their behavior. I have a solo flute piece that tries to sort of capture the sort of schizophrenic nature of mockingbirds, where at one moment they're incredibly just aggressive and irascible if something encroaches on their territory. But you can also sort of just catch them being very peaceful and placid and sort of just staring off into the distance like they're meditating. I have another piece composed in 2018 called Rubies in the Tiger's Eye, and that one was inspired by an encounter that I had with ruby-throated hummingbirds feasting off of the nectar of tiger lilies. And in this particular piece, I wanted the piece to sort of capture maybe not so much even the birds themselves, but just the scenic environment of going out early in the morning as darkness gives way to the daylight, and watching the environment like literally come alive with activity. And I do have pieces where I'll have a gesture or a motive that it might contain the profile of a bird call. So it's not exactly quoting a bird, but you can imagine many bird calls sort of have a profile that you can sort of imitate a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
but not directly quoting a Carolina Wren or a common grackle.
That's amazing. I really want to hear those pieces now, for real. So I've got one last question for you. You've already mentioned, you're born and grew up here in New Orleans. Shout outs to La Salle, right? And UNO, and of course here at Tulane where you did your graduate work. Where can people find you nowadays, and maybe what's next on your horizon?
So for the moment, I've been at Duke University pursuing a PhD in music composition. Next academic year will be year 7 and the final year. So at least physically, that's where I'll be in Durham, North Carolina, just wrapping everything up with the program. And the next stage is just making preparations for the job market. Teaching within the context of the university would be the ideal outcome. Although the job market is notoriously difficult and unforgiving, so beggars can't be choosers in some sense. But that is more or less the target that I'm trying to sort of strike out for the future.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, Ryan, and your contribution of this music for New Orleans Chamber Orchestra to perform. If everybody watching this video would like to see it too, you can help make it happen by sharing your time and a few dollar bills with us. There will be directions how to do that below the video. Otherwise, thank you again, Ryan, and we look forward to sharing your music with the world. Thank you.